It was the early evening hours of Sunday, April 19th, 2015. Vincent Viafore and his fiancee Angelika Graswald were trying to enjoy a kayaking adventure in the Hudson River, but the water was cold and choppy, and they were not adequately prepared for the conditions. For one, Vincent wasn't wearing a life vest, and his kayak was missing a drain plug. Disaster struck as they tried to cross the river, leaving from Bannermans Island heading towards Plum Point Park. Vincent's kayak started to take in water, eventually capsizing, leaving him to drown in the choppy water. Angelika called 911 on her cell phone from her kayak, but by the time emergency services arrived, it was far too late to save her fiancé. His body wouldn't be recovered from the water until a month later. When Angelika was questioned about how things had taken such a tragic turn, she made several statements that raised the alarm and had detectives wondering whether this was truly an accident or if she had planned his murder. Then there was the detail about the missing drain plug, which she admitted to removing from his kayak herself, and witnesses who claimed they saw her pull Vincent's paddle away from him, intentionally keeping him in the water. Her motive? A $550,000 life insurance policy, according to investigators. Angelika Graswald grew up in a middle-class family living in the city of Rezekne, Latvia. Her father was a police officer for a time before changing careers to work as an administrator at a trucking company. Her mother was a homemaker who was very much in charge of child rearing. Angelika always enjoyed spending as much of her time outside as possible, whether it was swimming, fishing, or camping. She was very much the kind of person who was always looking for her next adventure. So after graduating from university, she decided to place an ad in the newspaper looking for employment as an au pair. Working for a family as an au pair would offer her the chance to travel, see the world, and maybe even learn a new language. She was excited just thinking of all the possibilities. She landed her first au pair job working for a Norwegian family who was living in Greenwich, Connecticut, her chance to experience living in the United States. While she enjoyed being abroad in North America, she found the job to be challenging, so after 6 months she quit and instead applied to work at a local bar. This would allow her to stay in the States while having a much better work-life balance. Over the next decade, while living in America, she would be married twice and divorced twice. She was young and lonely without having her family around her, so things seemed to move quickly in her romantic relationships. Unfortunately, they just didn't work out, but she had a lot of positives in her life too. She found a passion for photography and had the opportunity to take some courses online, landing her a job as a camera operator for some time. Even after that employment ended, she never stopped taking pictures. She loved to document the beauty of the seemingly mundane things around her. She began volunteering at Bannerman Castle, which is a beautiful, historical, abandoned military surplus warehouse that looks like a castle. It is located on a small, picturesque, non-inhabited island in New York. While working as a volunteer there, she took beautiful photos of the gardens and the river, and even gave the other volunteers discs containing all of the photos for them to have as a keepsake. She was known as a charming, hard-working, and vivacious young woman who was generally just very sweet to the other volunteers and visitors to the castle. In September of 2013, while she was working at Fishkill Restaurant, 36-year-old Angelika met and began to date 46-year-old Vincent Viafore. Though she was 10 years his junior, she was older than the girls Vincent typically liked to date, who were quite a bit younger than him, like in their 20s. Vincent and Angelika had a lot in common. Not only did they both love the outdoors, but they had both been divorced twice before. Vincent seemed to have his life together. He had a great job working with the NICE Office of General Services Design and Construction Department as a certified code enforcement official and a senior project manager for over 20 years. He was well liked by just about everyone, including his ex-wives, with whom he was still on good terms, and he had a large group of friends. He was known to be the life of the party. Things moved quickly between the couple. Within a few weeks of meeting, Angelika moved into Vincent's condo, and just 5 months later, he proposed to her. They seemed to be very much in love and happy together. They had plans to marry the following summer in Latvia, but shortly before the wedding, they called it off. According to those closest to the couple, they had begun fighting a lot, and there were even times when Vincent had threatened to throw Angelika out of the condo. Later, Angelika would accuse Vincent of pressuring her to do things in the bedroom that she wasn't comfortable with, like having her be submissive to him and participating in threesomes. Still, they stayed together and tried to work it out. That brings us to April 19th, 2015, the day of the kayaking trip. Though the couple woke up hungover that morning after a night out, they were determined to go on this kayaking trip. It was an unusually warm and pleasant day for mid-April, but the weather was supposed to turn bad later in the evening. They should have called the whole thing off, because they didn't get going until 4:30 p.m. that evening. According to Vincent's sister, Laura, he texted her to let her know where he was going, and even included a diagram of the area, something that in hindsight she would find unusual. He had never texted her a map of where he was going on any other outings he had taken. The couple set off from Plum Point and planned to kayak over to Bannermans Island, where Angelika was a volunteer. Angelika had with her a purse, and she was wearing a life jacket over her sweatshirt. Vincent had his phone, a camera, and a day bag, but he opted not to bother with a life vest. It would take them approximately half an hour to reach the island, and once they got there, they had plans to do a sexy photo shoot, but it was too cold for the fishnet stockings Angelika had brought with her. Instead, they walked around the island drinking a few beers and taking a few less sexy photos of each other. Then the weather began to turn, and they decided it would be best to head back to Plum Point before it was too late. They got into their kayaks and headed down the Hudson River just after 7 p.m. The wind was picking up and the waves were growing, some as high as 3 feet, and Vincent's kayak filled with water and capsized. Vincent plunged into the cold water with no life vest or wetsuit on. It wouldn't have taken long for him to begin to lose all of his gross motor skills because of the freezing temperatures of the river. At approximately 7:40 p.m., 911 dispatch gets a call from Angelika Graswald. Angelika tells the dispatcher that her fiance's kayak has flipped over and he's drowning in the river. She gives them their location and tells them to send anybody to help. It sounds like she's trying to get her kayak over to him, because while he doesn't have a life jacket on, he's trying to hold onto a small floating cushion, but the waves are washing him further away from him. Later into the call, she's crying and she says she can't see Vincent any longer. The dispatcher tells her to try paddling towards the emergency vehicles on shore. As she's doing this, Angelika's kayak flips and she falls into the river too, just before a boat rescues her from the water. That night, she is taken by ambulance to the hospital and treated for hypothermia while search teams attempt to find Vincent in the river. According to officers who took her statement that evening, Angelika seemed unusually calm for what she had just experienced. Allegedly, she was emotionless. Even more strange was a statement given by an eyewitness who claimed that she had flipped her own kayak just before being rescued by the boat. Investigators also believed that she may have taken his paddle away from him so that he wouldn't be able to use it to rescue himself. The next day, Vincent's blue kayak is recovered near Plum Point. However, the search team fails to find his body and has to suspend the search because of bad weather. Initially, the kayak trip and Vincent's drowning was treated like a tragic accident, but those close to the situation revealed that Angelika's behavior during the following days made them feel uneasy. According to family members, she began to give her fiance's belongings away, including his much-loved meat smoker, claiming that he would have wanted them to have it. At a family gathering to honor Vincent's memory, she was seen doing cartwheels. His family starts to wonder if perhaps she is a little too happy that her fiancé is now gone. On April 29th, 10 days after the kayaking incident, Angelika returned to Bannerman Island with a group of volunteers to lay a floral wreath she had made in honor of Vincent. The police were also there, and they wanted to speak to her. At the time, she had no idea that they were looking at her as the person who may be responsible for Vincent's death. They asked her to show them around the island and to point to any notable locations that may help them piece together what happened to her fiancé. This is when Angelika made several other concerning statements. According to the report, the police officers mentioned that when they examined Vincent's kayak, they noticed the drain plug was missing, and Angelika informed them that she had been the one to take it out and had put it in a drawer in their shared apartment. This, combined with her odd behavior, was enough for investigators to decide to bring her back to the station for further questioning. It's here that she would be interrogated for 11 hours, which is a grueling amount of time. Before any of the questions were asked, one officer could be heard on the recording saying, "It's therapy for you. You'll feel better." Angelika did not ask for a lawyer because she didn't realize that was being looked at as a murder suspect. Still, she talks about how she had wanted Vincent to do because of how controlling he was and the sexual demands he made of her. He pushed for the couple to engage in threesomes, even though Angelika didn't want to. According to her statements, he wanted her to be submissive in the bedroom, and he wanted to dominate her, which made her extremely uncomfortable and caused them to fight. She says, "I wanted him dead, and now he's gone, and I'm okay with it," but also denies killing him. She admits to removing the drain plug from her fiancé's kayak, but she says that it had been removed months prior and was now sitting in the drawer of their apartment. Investigators question her about keeping the paddle away from Vincent while he was in the water, and she denies it, stating that she did grab onto the paddle, but it had drifted away from him already because his hands were full. He may have even pushed it towards her to pick up so that it didn't get lost. Towards the end of the interrogation, she makes several more strange remarks about sensing that her fiancé was going to die that day and how she felt at peace now. The investigator asks, "Why did you want him to die? How could you best put it?" And she answers, "I wanted to be free," a startling confession. If nothing else, she was incredibly naive about how her statements might have consequences, but she didn't seem to notice the way the room had shifted. When she was done talking, 11 hours later, she asked if she could go home to feed her cats. This reminds me of the interrogation of Brendan Dassey, who was accused and eventually convicted of the murder of Teresa Halbach. He was 16 years old when he was questioned by police for hours without his mother present. He has a very low IQ, and it's evident in the way the questions were presented that he is being led towards a specific narrative. At the end of his interrogation, when he has admitted to murder, he asks if he can go home now to watch wrestling. He has no idea of what has just happened. Brendan has spent the last 18 years trying to exonerate himself and get out of prison. When Angelika's interrogation was over, they put her into handcuffs and told her that she was being arrested for the murder of her fiancé. She would later say that it wasn't until that moment that she realized she was a suspect in his death. Angelika Graswald was charged with second-degree murder and eventually manslaughter. They believed that she had deliberately removed the drain plug for his kayak so that it would fill up with water and capsize. They also believed that she had tampered with his paddle by removing the ring that secured it together, and then when he fell into the water, they believed she kept the paddle away from him so that he couldn't hold onto it and would ultimately drown. The motive: 2 life insurance policies totaling $550,000. Vincent had added Angelika as the beneficiary of the policies just months after they began dating. It's a lot of money for most people, but especially Angelika, who came from nothing and owned nothing of value. She would plead not guilty to the charges of murder in the second degree and manslaughter in the second degree. Her bond is set at $9 million because she is considered a serious flight risk. While she is in police custody waiting to go to trial, the body of her fiancé, Vincent Viafore, is recovered from the Hudson River. He had been missing in the water for a little over a month. A small bit of solace as his family can now lay him to rest. That fall, while still waiting for her trial to begin, Angelika gives an interview to 20/20. She's asked about the statement she made to the police during her interrogation, particularly what she said about being at peace with his death and wanting to be free. She would clarify that what I meant was I wanted to be free from the lifestyle that we had, the nightlife, the strip clubs, the threesomes. I didn't want any part of that. I wanted to be free from that. But as far as he goes, I wanted to be with him. Vincent's family has never believed that to be true, that he was that kind of person, but truly, how would they ever know what he was like in the bedroom with his romantic partner behind closed doors? Angelika's defense attorney fights to have her confession tossed because he says it's meaningless and obtained illegally. According to the defense, Angelika only became a suspect in her fiance's death after telling the detectives about the drain plug she had removed and how she took her fiance's paddle after his kayak had capsized, but she had not yet been read her Miranda rights. They also claimed that the alleged confession was coerced after a grueling 11 hours of interrogating Angelika. Still, the judge rules that the taped confession can be admitted into court. It's the most damning piece of evidence that the prosecution has. The other evidence is circumstantial. At the end of the day, Angelika will be tried based on whether or not the jury believes that she was happy her fiancé had died. Her defense team knew they would have an uphill battle, because her behavior certainly wasn't typical for what you would imagine a grieving lover to be. But did that make her a killer? An expert working for the defense certainly didn't think so. According to forensic scientist Michael Archer, this case had all of the signs of an accidental drowning. The water was frigid. It was windy and the waves were growing as high as 5 feet. Even the most experienced kayakers would have had trouble staying upright in those conditions. Vincent didn't have a life jacket on or a wetsuit, so he would have lost most of his bodily functions within minutes of falling into the water. Combine that with the fact that they had been drinking beer when they were walking around the island, and it could add up to an accidental death. But what about that drain plug, which Angelika had admitted to removing during the off-season and putting into a drawer? During reenactments of the situation, keeping the drain plug out of a kayak that they used to test to see what would happen, the water that the kayak took on was very minimal. The plug is actually on top of the boat, not at the bottom, and about the size of a pinky finger, so the only water it would take on is from waves, and it would only be the smallest amount. These experts believe that the kayak took water on from the cockpit, where Vincent had been sitting, which would be due to the weather conditions, not action taken by a human. Police also alleged that Angelika had tampered with the paddle by removing the ring that holds the two ends together. But according to the experts, the paddle performs perfectly fine, even without the ring. And even if Angelika hadn't taken the paddle out of the water, if Vincent had been able to hang on to it, it likely wouldn't have been enough to save him. Not without a life jacket. Any significant amount of weight on the paddle would have instantly sunk it. Still, the statements made by Angelika did not look good, and the defense team knew it. So when the prosecution offered a plea deal, her attorney encouraged her to take it. Angelika would need to plead guilty to the lesser felony charge of negligent homicide. She would be able to maintain her innocence of intentionally killing Vincent, but she would have to admit that she was aware of the risks that were taken that day that contributed to his tragic drowning. Which, in my opinion, is kind of crazy if you think about it. Vincent was a grown man of almost 50 years old. He decided not to wear a life vest or wetsuit. He also decided to use his kayak on the choppy river that day. It's horrible that he drowned that day, but if we're assuming that Angelika didn't intend for her fiancé to die that day, then it seems a bit unfair to charge her with a felony for the decisions that he willfully made. Unless the prosecution truly believes that she killed Vincent, but isn't confident that they will be able to get a guilty verdict. It's one of the troubling things about our justice system. Sometimes a person has to take the charge, take the jail time, take the felony, even if they're innocent, just so that they can escape a life behind bars. And sometimes a guilty person gets a lessened sentence, just to face any kind of justice at all. There's no winning. With the acceptance of the plea deal, a jury would never hear the recording of that 11-hour interrogation. It may have been the best decision for her, because it's difficult for many to understand how someone who has just tragically lost their fiancé could act so cold, calm, and even euphoric after their death. Angelika would be sentenced to 1.5 to 4 years in state prison, the maximum allowed for criminally negligent homicide, but she would be released after serving just over 2.5 years. In the end, she would be able to collect on Vincent's life insurance policy. At least on a portion of it, though, the amount she received has been kept confidential. Typically, convicted murderers can't financially benefit from the deaths of their victims for very obvious reasons. But because she took the plea deal for negligent homicide, she was able to cash in on her portion. Vincent's family did file a wrongful death lawsuit to try to prevent her from getting the insurance money, but they withdrew their case, and it appears they just want to move on. Because she accumulated nearly $500,000 in lawyers' fees during the trial, it's probably safe to assume that any money she did inherit went directly to her legal team.